When we look at a place, what do we see? Well, as sociologists, we have more than one way of seeing. A paradigm is a mode of representation that allows us to create a theory, which is a way of seeing. So, depending on the paradigm we use, and depending on the theory we choose within each paradigm, we'll have a different way of representing the world around us, and a different way of seeing the place we happen to be in. To flesh out this abstract idea just a little bit, let's take a look at a place a little closer to home for most of us. This class is organized at the University of Maine at Augusta, which is part of the state of Maine. Today, we'll take a look at 3 communities: Belfast, Winterport, and Bangor. How can we see these communities just a little bit differently?
Right now I'm standing in Wales Park in Belfast, Maine. By Maine standards, a relatively large town of about 6,660 people by last count. Now, Belfast has a number of institutions in it. It has a library institution. It has a post office. It also has a branch of the University of Maine in the Hutchinson Center, although the classes that are offered there are mostly by video conference and on the web. There are a few that are in person. Notably, Waldo County Medical Center is a hospital that provides a number of medical services, including some surgeries, but in terms of trauma and other more specialized care, usually refers those out to Bangor or Portland or even Boston, which have more specialized, larger hospitals available. Now, the town of Winterport is certainly not among the smallest towns in Maine, but it is on the smaller side at about 3,700 people. Founded a long time ago in the 1760s. It's on the Penobscot River and has served as a river port, even though it's not on a bay or an ocean itself. Now, Winterport has a beautiful library, a memorial library. It has a post office, and it has an elementary school and a middle school of its own. But it does not have a high school. In order to send students to high school, it must send its students up to Hampton. It also relies on Hampton for police coverage, for public safety, and it does not have a hospital of its own, either of a trauma center or any hospital with beds. So individuals need to head north to Bangor for those services. Finally, it does not have any institutions of higher education, no colleges, no universities are present, and it must interact with Bangor to the north or Orono for universities. Finally, we're here in Bangor, Maine, one of Maine's largest cities at about 33,000. Now, while Belfast has a Hutchinson Center to provide some classes, mostly by video conference and by video, the city of Bangor has not simply the University of Maine at Augusta's Bangor campus, it also has Husson University, it has Beale College, it has Eastern Maine Community College. As a hospital, Eastern Maine Medical Center has a trauma unit. It is a place to which people come on a regional basis to gain health care and a number of specialized services. There's University of Maine's Orono flagship campus, which is right next to Bangor, and some would say a suburb of Bangor. In addition, of course, Bangor has a number of libraries, a number of schools, a number of post offices. It has a major airport into which major airlines fly in and out across the country and even up to Canada. Bangor's additional size allows it to have much more infrastructure, and as a community it is much more self-supporting.
Now, it might be tempting, especially if you live in the city of Bangor to think that this is all about a matter of psychology, that the amount of infrastructure that different towns are able to provide is a function of how much those towns really want to provide those pieces of infrastructure. Is it the case that the people of Winterport really just don't care about higher education? Is it the case that the people of Bangor just care about their health more? I don't think that makes sense. I think it makes much more sense to say that the town of Winterport cannot support a university, that the town of Belfast, while it can support a hospital, is not able to maintain a trauma unit because it simply doesn't have enough population to take care of that to make functional sense. This kind of argument is a functional argument in two ways. First, it's been focusing on what makes up the institutional structure of a town: law enforcement, education, literacy, and so forth, healthcare. Second, it's been thinking about functional reasons for the health and stability of individual towns and the way that those individual towns work together to support one another, so that Hampton and Winterport are able to put together a fairly significant high school in a way that neither town could alone. This is the kind of argument that a sociologist working under the functionalist paradigm would provide. Of course, this is not the only way to look at those towns, because we as sociologists have more than one way of seeing. We have more than one paradigm. What I've just described is the functionalist paradigm approach, but a conflict paradigmatic approach has a unique way of representing the world, not just as filled with conflict, which the title implies, but conflict over scarce resources. That conflict is carried out by people, not just individual people who don't like each other, but people who occupy those positions. And because they occupy those positions have certain interests associated with them, certain benefits, certain dangers, and certain opportunities. So those positions with those particular interests have associated with them certain amounts of power. Power being the ability of one party to get a second party to do what that second party doesn't want to do. Those differences in power lead to observable differences in outcomes, in terms of money, happiness, status, other kinds of desired resources. And those differences in outcomes are called stratification. So conflict, resources, positions, interests, and power all lead to results that we can observe, which are observable differences in some kind of resource that we're interested in, or some kind of happy outcome that we'd like to have, and differences, observable differences in those outcomes between people in different positions is called stratification. This is a really different way of thinking about a place than by simply looking at institutions. What institutions does a town have? Well, that's a functionalist perspective. Who's getting what in a conflict over resources? That's a conflict paradigm perspective. This is a paradigm which you should have had some contact with if you ever read the news. A few years ago, there was an Occupy social movement, and it happened not just in New York City, but also in Washington, D.C., in Bangor, in Augusta, in Portland, in Maine. And it had people who were talking in explicit terms of a conflict paradigm. They took the conflict paradigm and they applied it to economics. And they said, who's earning most of the money? Who's not earning most of the money in our society? And they even used terms like 99%, the 99% poorest people in the country, and the 1% richest. And they identified those two positions as occupying opposed positions in a conflict over resources. So we can apply that to the towns of Winterport, Belfast, and Bangor, and we can do that by looking at data from the 2013 American Community Survey carried out by the U.S. Bureau of the Census Bureau. We can take a look at, in any of these three towns, all the income earned in those towns. And then we can think about, well, say in Winterport, who earned all that money? Taking all of the people in Winterport and dividing them into fifths. So each 20%, because 20% times 5 is 100% all of the people. Imagine that you have people ranked so that you have the poorest 20%, you have the richest 20%, and you have people in between in terms of income that they earned in 2013. How much does the lowest 20% have in Winterport? Well, about 5%. They earned about 5% of all the income earned in Winterport. The highest 20% earned about 40% of all income. Compare that to Bangor on the right. In Bangor, the highest 20% earned more than half of all the income. And if you look carefully, you can see that the lowest income earning 20% earned slightly less than in Winterport. So in Bangor, the 20% highest income earners earned a greater share of all income. The bottom 20% earned less than in Winterport. We can say then that there is more inequality. There's more difference between the top 20% and the bottom 20% in Bangor than there is in Winterport, with Belfast lying somewhere in between. Conflict is not just about economics. It's not just only about money. Sometimes when we think about these scarce resources, money is the most easily measured, we can think about other dimensions of inequality. People occupy a number of different positions, and one of them is a position according to gender. Now, if we go back to the American Community Survey in 2013, and we look at people who are all working full-time, all working year-round, and they're all adults, at least aged 16 or over, we can compare the median income of women to the median income of men. And in fact, we can divide the two in a fraction. When we do that, the nice thing that happens is that we can figure out what share of men's income women earn. If you think about a fraction, the number on top is equal to the number on the bottom. Any number divided by itself equals 1. If the number on top is higher than the number on the bottom, the resulting number will be larger than 1. And if the number on top is smaller than the number on the bottom, the result will be smaller than 1. In particular, if you multiply that result times 100, you get a percent. What's the percent that women earn compared to men? And here we see, if we multiply these resulting numbers by 100, we see that in Belfast, women earn, who are all working full-time year-round, 79% of what men in Belfast earn. In Winterport, 84%. In Bangor, 92%. So think about the difference between the gender inequality, the gender stratification in Bangor and Belfast. And you see there's this huge difference in how well men do versus how well women do. In none of these circumstances do women overall earn more than men. Always, on average, men are earning more than women. But the margin by which they do so varies a lot between these different towns. And so if you want to understand these towns from a conflict paradigm, this is really important information for you to look at. Information you might not think to look at if you were just working from a functionalist perspective. Now, we have three big paradigms in sociology: functionalism, the conflict paradigm, and the third is the symbolic interactionist paradigm. And it's really different, because if the conflict paradigm is all about positions, right, and the functionalist paradigm is all about institutions, those are large units, and they're not strictly people, right? They're about groups of people either working together and taking on roles to help a society. That's functionalism and institutions, or their positions in competition, and that is conflict theory. All macro sociology, going back to chapter 1 in your textbook. However, if you want to think just about people, actual individual people, and what individual people do, symbolic interactionism is your perspective. It is your paradigm. It's your way of seeing the world, because it is a micro paradigm. A paradigm is a way of representing the world. Symbolic interactionism represents the world in terms of people who talk to each other, who interact with each other, who do things together, who relate to each other, who create meaning when they talk to each other, who share experiences and hopes and dreams and expectations for each other. We do that all the time. We have expectations for each other. But while we communicate those expectations and we work together and we build meaning, we make cultures. Cultures consisting of ideas and practices, ways things are done. This is what symbolic interactionism is all about. Well, how can we think about places in Maine in that regard? Well, if you're taking my class, you'll notice I've already asked you to do that with the Map It exercise, in which I've asked you to, without looking at a map of Maine, draw the map of Maine and then label it. And I didn't give you any instructions beyond that. And I said, upload it. And I said, don't worry about being accurate, just do your best. Now, I can't show on this public forum the private submissions of students, but I asked my 10-year-old daughter to do the same. And this is what she produced. It's got the general shape of Maine. It's pretty good for a 10-year-old. It has the city of Augusta. It has trees. It has mountains. All in the center part of the state, with Augusta being a little bit closer to the coast than we might otherwise think if we were going to be literal. On the other hand, the top and the bottom of the state are empty. Why is that? Well, my daughter lives in the center part of the state, as do I. Not the south, not the north, but central Maine. And so she's emphasized that here. It's a general pattern that students in the class, if you look at one another's submitted maps, did the same thing. Those who lived in the north emphasized the north. Those who live in the south emphasized the south. Those who live in the center or the west emphasize those features. That's one really interesting symbolic interactionist result, because it indicates what? The idea of Maine we have, the expectation for what Maine will be, to use symbolic interactionist words, consists of the set of ideas consisting of our experience and the experience of those we talk to, who are those in our communities. It's what we think about. It's what we talk about. It's what's local. We emphasize the local, and everything else goes out of our mind. For those students who had images from all over the state, they were students who travel all over the state for work or for recreation. And they included those work and recreation aspects. So the second thing to point out is that there are certain elements included here. Trees, mountains, and the capital city of Maine. Why these? Why not other things? The notion of cities, the notion of trees and mountains and animals, the typical animals being a moose or a lobster, were included over and over and over again in these maps. The other element that my daughter did not include that a lot of people included were major roads. Not minor roads, but major roads. Why are these things included on a map? Are they part of our experience? Well, there are parts of our experience that are not included. Shopping marts. Where are the malls? No student included a mall. Where are the grocery stores? Not included. Right? Well, what about other kinds of things? Natural resources. Beyond trees and mountains. Something you might get from a mine. Well, that's not included. Where the different rocks are, not included. Elevation, beyond mountains, not included. All sorts of things, if we think about Maine and what is in Maine, that are not included. Why? Because we have a cultural idea of what a map should be. I only instructed you to include elements. Your culture told you what those elements should be and what they shouldn't be. And so the map you provided reflected that.